Drew also works with CASA, a coalition for immigrant rights, is in the process of publishing research about mixed status families living under one roof in Oregon. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Emily Drew.
Testing. Okay, great. Yep. Okay. Sorry. Okay, my speech is over here. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Oh, thank you for this invitation. I think one of these years I'm going to be too old for Beanie to invite back, because it's a youth-led movement here. Actually, I wanted to, first I wanted to thank you. I know on my campus we don't have anything like this, so I appreciate that every year so many of you come together for this kind of important event. And part of what I wanted to bring to us today and offer as are what I'm going to call 6 gifts that were offered to me. I've been doing this work now about 25 years, and a lot of people have poured a lot of insight into me. Those people are disproportionately women of color who have invested a great deal of energy into helping me learn and grow. And so I always need to lift that up as the source of so much of what I've learned. And what I wanted to do at our lunchtime today is offer a little bit of those gifts to pay it forward. What has been given to me, I wanted to give back, hopefully with a little extra insight on how it is happening today. So the first thing that I just want to say is 25 years in, I'm not an elder yet, but I'm also not young anymore. And so I feel like I'm in that in-between generation where still something is expected of me before I get to move into elder status, if that happens. I don't get to choose that, right? It's like declaring yourself an ally. It doesn't actually work that way. So what I wanted to do to begin is to ask you, with your mouth completely full as possible, to talk with a neighbor about a story about the last time you changed your mind about something that matters. And before you start that mouth talking, let's do some thinking, especially for our internal processors. Let's take a minute before we start. That's still not enough, but let's take a minute and think about when was the last time we changed our minds about something that mattered. Let's think. Is there anyone who could help me black out the screen right now? There, we'll just put that. Let's talk to that neighbor. We'll share an example. Share a story of the last time you changed your mind about something that matters. I do. I need help with what moves forward and backwards. It's doing it again. Oh, so don't use this thing at all. Okay, so how do I escape out of this? How do I get out of this? It shouldn't be up there. Okay, so can you get it on that screen? Testing, testing. Yep, it's fine. Okay. Let's take one more minute. One more minute. If I could, needs to be louder. I know how to do it. If I could invite us back. Is this the one? Nope, I did the wrong one. I don't know if it's the location. I don't normally struggle with mics, sorry. Hello? Okay, okay. If I could invite us back. Okay, if I could please have a show of hands for how many people was it in the last week they changed their mind about something that matters? Okay, small handful. Last month, do we increase it? How many people has it been more than a year in the story you shared? Okay, about half of us. I think one of the things that's interesting about how people who are studying the neuroplasticity of the brain suggest that we actually have the capability and spend most of our childhood constantly being able to change our mind, to change our opinion, to let new information in. I can't help but wonder if there's something about our educational processes that actually go against that get us to become fairly fixed in what we begin to think about the world. And so what I want to propose to you is not just that it's okay to change your opinion, but that I think it's significantly important for us to be about the work of constantly gathering new information and new tools about how to communicate that. A lot of times we end up thinking, I've got this, and that ultimately we probably don't. So here's where I'd like to move us. If I'm going to think about the gifts that will help us constantly grow and evolve in the work of social justice, the first thing I wanted to offer, this will be the only GRE LSAT word, which is praxis. This actually comes from Aristotle, and before you tune out and start thinking, wait, I'm at a social justice conference, I would pose to you that this gift of praxis, in a little while I'm going to ask you how you've practiced these 6 different gifts. The gift of praxis says that each time we learn about something, we need to act upon it, right? For any of you who have tried to lose weight or get healthy bodies, we can only do so much reflecting on all the strategies to be fit, right? At some point, we have to actually move our butt to the gym or to the put on the skates and get out and do the workouts. So that thinking about praxis as what Aristotle called one of the 3 conditions fundamental to being human, praxis is an essential tool if we want to do effective social justice work. I'll give you an example. When I was 18 in college, we were studying homelessness. That's what we called it back in the 90s. And one of the things that we read about was this term called the feminization of poverty. That meant to say that women and children, and what we would now understand as gender non-binary folks, tend to experience this at a disproportionate rate, experience poverty and homelessness. So my group of social justice-minded friends and I, having reflected upon the feminization of poverty, decided that what we would like to do is have a big drive and collect feminine hygiene products. Because we knew that poverty was disproportionately harming women, and we wanted to take action. We wanted to give people what we thought that they needed. Now, we're in New Orleans, that's where I went to undergrad, and we take a huge van of feminine hygiene products, and we go down to the city center in New Orleans, where our encampments are of people who are unhoused. And who do you think we discovered there? Yeah, a whole lot of men. In fact, not any women. So here we are with a van full of tampons, a strong conviction about what we read, an action, because we didn't want to just think things to death. And we're now there with a van full of tampons and a park full of men, and we're saying, maybe we missed something. So we start talking with people. We come back to the literature to find out, why is it that if this disproportionately affects women, why is it mostly men down here? What we learned, of course, was that social services and all of the social safety networks work to get women and youth housed first, housed temporarily, and that men are often kept out of those systems in order to reserve slots for women and children. So we decided to take a different action. We knew we couldn't show up the next Saturday morning with a van full of pads, and we decided to show up instead with food, sack lunches. Now we're getting better at our action, but when we started talking with the men living in Jackson Square, one of the things they said to us, they said, this food is great, but what we really need is someone to pay attention to what's happening to us at 2 in the morning. That's when the law enforcement are doing the raids and coming in and rounding us up, because we have criminalized even the ability to lay down on a bench in this city for the sake of tourists. So what we did in this process of reflection and action, it then shifted our locus from let's prepare sandwiches on Saturday morning to let's take on the criminalization of homelessness in our legislature. Now, it didn't mean people still didn't need to eat, right? They still needed some support to survive. So that praxis is one of these tools that if we're constantly engaging in reflection and action, we can produce better work as a result. I think of this in my own classroom. For many years, I was teaching 10th through 12th grade students, almost entirely Latinx students. And one of the things that they appreciated about me was I would say a lot of things in Spanish in my classroom. As a white educator, they would say, I appreciate having some of my home language be validated, be present in the classroom. Well, that worked in one setting, and then I went to another setting, like my college classroom, and I got immediately written up on all of our microaggression blogs for having appropriated Spanish as a white teacher in a classroom. So that I understand now, and it took me a moment, right? I'm like, actually, my Latinx students are saying they appreciate it. I'm doing it to try to center their home languages. And now I'm getting nailed for it. And instead of reacting, like white people are gonna white, and crying and getting defensive and all that sort of stuff, I decided, why don't I actually turn to my colleagues who do this work to help me understand why this is viewed as appropriation. So that praxis can help us over time, it can help us over context, it helps us to develop more effective strategies. So if I was to ask, when was the last time you engaged in praxis instead of changing your mind? That would be one of those tools that could serve movement building in our work. I would say that the second gift given to me from a few years in this work is the gift of living in what we would call both and, right? That two competing realities are both simultaneously true. Let me give you a short example. I do a lot of workshops and training with women of color, with a colleague of color. We go in pairs. And one particular, a friend of mine, a mentor of mine, an Asian American woman, we were doing a workshop and something pretty rough came at her, right? People were like, what's your source on that? And she was talking about the secret war in Laos, right? And the opioid problem of 50 years ago in our country. And they didn't believe it, like it's a conspiracy theory. And she got shouted down by a participant. And afterwards, she looked at me and she said, where were you? I needed you to have my back. Well, where I was sitting there on eggshells, afraid to overstep, right? And she said, I really felt unsupported, like you didn't have my back. So we did some work to repair some of that, and we show up at the next workshop, and someone challenges her again. It's very predictable white behaviors, right? Someone challenges her again, and this time, from my seat, I'm like, well, right? I'm like, I'm not gonna make that mistake again. So I jump in, I think, yeah, I learned something. And as some of you might predict, during our debrief, she said to me, I really didn't appreciate your white saviorism, right? Like I had it. So I'm sitting here thinking, okay, last time it was this, last time it was this, both are true, right? I think in dominant culture in the United States is the tendency to get us to think there is but one right way. I want the rules. Give me the rules of how to be an anti-racist, right? And that rule approach is not actually leading us any closer to being better humans, right? It's just teaching us to follow some new socialization rules. So that both realities can be simultaneously true, and that to live in ambiguity, what Gloria Anzaldúa and indigenous scholars call the borderlands, right? To live in La Frontera, the land where both and simultaneously exist, is a land that recognizes there are no pure solutions and no perfect people. I don't know if you all are grappling with this yet, but out at a lot of social justice organizations, there has been an introduction of this term called BIPOC, right? B-I-P-O-C, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And this is a great example to me of there are competing realities that are both true at the same time. So that years ago, when we didn't have the language of people of color, which is a coalitional term about different people of color groups having different experiences with white supremacy, but being united in the fact that it affects everyone. And so this temptation then now is to pull out Black as a specific experience, right? The B in BIPOC says, well, it's not just white supremacy, It's also anti-Blackness. Black folks saying we need special attention in an arrangement of white supremacy that deals us a special hand, right? And I don't mean special in a good way. So that what begins to happen then is getting challenged by indigenous people, African American leaders, then say, oh, well, Indians have had it bad too. Indigenous Native people also deserve a letter. So we end up then with BIPOC. And the Ls, meaning the Latinxes, are going, where the hell are we? The APIA, the Asian American Pacific Islander folks, are saying, where's our letter? And we're watching then Oppression Olympics, Oppression Hunger Games play out into the who's going to get the letter that's differentiated from POC and who's not. So we end up then, instead of having people of color caucuses, we have Black caucus, Indigenous caucus, the rest of people of color caucus, right? And the groups get more and more divided and fragmented after about 4 decades of trying to figure out how to at least build convergent interests. So we have both a divide and conquer strategy and a need to not lump all people of color together, right? That anti-Blackness should get its own attention, should get its own matrix and its own analysis. So both realities end up being true, then we're left deciding, well, what are we gonna use? Which are we gonna do in our organization? So what begins to happen then is further fragmentation, but that can be solved if we work to. Pure solutions and no perfect people. The other thing I would add about the no perfect people is our need for us to have multiple mentors. If you haven't already discovered it, our mentors are human. And what frequently happens in social justice work is there's this like fall from grace when we find out that they're human. That we had them up on a pedestal, we find out that they do something that goes against the very social justice values they inspired in us, and then we want to throw them away. And I would urge us to be mindful that in this both and, we are both human and messing uppers, right? That we ultimately are affected by this arrangement. So I think then the third gift I would say, so we have praxis and we have living in both and I would say that one of the other gifts is to have a belt that has many tools on it. Whenever I am out giving a talk or leading people on a event, I always get asked, how do I respond to someone when? Right? Or even when my students get ready to go home for winter break. Like, how am I going to respond to that uncle, to that friend, to that person I went to high school with? And part of what I think I would like to encourage us is, one question to ask is, how am I going to respond to be effective? And what that usually means is, what people are looking for is they're looking for like the silver bullet, the blueprint. Give me that one line that's going to change the person. Yeah, thank you for shaking your head, right? It doesn't exist. And that in fact, what I need to have when I go out is I need to have lots of tools. I need to have the story tool. When I hear something, I can say, I've got a good story for you. I need to have the humor tool so that I don't become the Drew that stole Christmas at every holiday in my family, right? Well, let me talk to you about what the 4th of July represents, right? They think I've just ruined every holiday that exists. So that we don't become that, how do we have the humor tool, the story tool? I have some data and facts tool, though that's actually the least effective tool in terms of people changing their minds. And I liked what Alex said this morning, that when he showed up at that woman's house, he asked her a question, right? So I didn't come here to fight with you and convince you. I came with a good question so that we could begin to see some interests that we have in common, even if we disagree on the issues. I think the other piece of this question, how do I respond using strategy, is not just to be effective, but to be sustainable. So what I mean by that is, a lot of times the focus is only on being effective at changing the other person's mind. What if we could also say, what should I use at this moment right now to be sustainable in this work? And sometimes that means I need to walk away, that I'm not the right person to be talking to you. One of the tricks that I think white supremacy and other systems of like heteropatriarchy do on us is they get us to pay a lot of attention to the noisiest person or the biggest resistor in any situation. And that in the time I spend trying to convince the biggest resistor, I could have won the movement 10 allies. It's almost like a smoke and mirrors distraction technique, right? On my campus, whenever we have some racist Halloween party or some horrible event on campus, they want to send me in with this team to be like the police, the diversity police. Come help us put out this fire. I know that the time it will take me, and I won't name which organizations do it, the time it will take me to work with them, I can have won over 6 other student organizations in that time. So sometimes to be sustainable, we have to not do the work, or we have to recognize that we're not the right person to be doing the work. In that period between President Obama and President Trump's transition, when we went from the deporter-in-chief to a president that was talking very openly about building walls. In my community, we organized what would be considered a harbor, like safe spaces, so that we could take people into our homes who were not documented. And one of the things that came up is we were trying to do cross-racial organizing around an issue that none of us were prepared to work with one another in. And a colleague and I were trying to help set up who's going to go to whose house, right? Because I think we were under the belief at that time that the deportations and raids were going to start like on day 1, and that people needed physical safety and homes at that moment to literally hide. And there was a pretty horrifying comment that came out from one of the people who was willing to host. And we're all kind of thinking, oh man, we don't really want anyone to live there. That wouldn't be too safe for them. And my colleague of color, Latina, with one of our organizations, looked at me and right out loud in front of everyone, she goes, "She's yours." Right, like she wasn't even gonna waste a minute trying to respond to that nonsense. And she was signaling to me, that's one of your people, go talk to her. So that ultimately being sustainable often means making choices about who not to take with us. Though this was left out of the Harriet Tubman film of this past year, one of the things Sister Harriet taught us as she was standing, often with a rifle, bringing people from Africa who were enslaved, bringing them to safe havens, is if some folks were too slow to come along, she said, we're going without you. Because if we wait for you, we're all gonna get killed. And so that's been a shift for me in my thinking. I was like, we've gotta have everyone. No, actually, maybe we just need 60%. Maybe we just need the right 30% to create a critical mass so that we don't get ourselves killed or become unsustainable while waiting for those very last stragglers and resistors. I would also say that the last thing about this gift, when I kept writing this, I kept calling it a tool of many belts, which, by the way, has a very different website it takes you to for a graphic. So I wouldn't recommend it. So I haven't messed up yet, a belt of many tools. And that is that I think so often when many of us are in that, how do I convince so-and-so? How do I talk to so-and-so? Usually the answer is that I give, put the mirror up to yourself, right? What am I doing that is the same behavior that I now find offensive in that other person? What am I doing, for example, that is ableist in even how I've structured a talk, in the language that I'm using, right? I think about this in class. We were studying, I teach a Black Lives Matter class, and we were studying Zendaya, who's like this badass Olympic athlete from South Africa. And she's getting all that hormone testing because people are very afraid of being beat by her. And I said a comment in a small group with my students because they were teaching. I said something about Why are we studying her during a week on trans athletes? She's not even trans, she's an actual woman, right? Yeah, thank you, gasp. That I think the thing is that the gender binary in my conditioning is so deep that even though I do this work and even though I have values around gendering people that are informed by the trans activist community, it still comes out of me. So if we think we're going to be perfect allies, we're not. And so that part of my task anytime I want to confront someone else is to also figure out when have I done this? What tools do I need? Right? I think this is a community where you can get many of those tools. And then we practice. So the thing I didn't say that I regret, or that thing I stumbled over, how do I practice? This is part of why, in thinking about the Black Lives Matter chapter out of South Carolina, you might recognize Bree Newsom up there taking down the Confederate flag at her state capitol, right? It was put back up, and now successfully they've gotten it through the legislature. But what we see on the news, right, is the 3 or 4 people standing beneath her. She had a legal observer, a filmer. She had a white dude, by the way, who stood with just one of those little construction vests on to make it look like she was officially up there. And that way most people would just pass by and think she was doing official business. They practiced every ins and outs of this action before they did it. So that I think we often lose sight of the value of practicing even within social justice work. I would say the 4th gift comes to us from the AARP, the Annual Association of Retired Persons, right? I think it's funny, they tell us how to fall safely. And that for any of us who have taken a fall, we find out that actually what gets us hurt isn't the fall, right? It's the stiffening of our body to prevent the fall. And so that the AARP recommends that there are ways to fall well. So let's think about that, right? The first thing is to stay bent. I think that is apt for us as we think about what it means to stay agile and nimble in this work. I know you're very young, so you may not have seen The Matrix. If you haven't, good to check out. But how do we be like Neo so that no matter what they're throwing at us, I can just zoom right and it goes over me, right? That sort of agility that allows us to stay upright in the work, stay bent, stay flexible. Also in the resiliency literature right now, part of it involves taking a breath and hydrating, right? Imagine what it would be in those moments when we're doing hard lifting of social justice work, to breathe, to hydrate. This one's obvious. Protect your head. Enough said. Land on the meat. I love this one, trying to think about what is the meat of social justice work. If we have communities of resistance, they will be there to help us when we fall, right, when we land. The people with whom, as Alex said this morning, will invest in us, will cheer us on, right? And I would add, will tell us the truth about ourselves. I often call this the spinach in my teeth friends. It's the I'm walking around with a big old chunk of stuff in my teeth and they're like, girl, you got a little something in your grill. Because they don't want me to be out embarrassing myself in front of everyone else, right? That's an act of love to let me know about my spinach teeth. I would add then, as the AARP does, we need to keep falling. That if we are not taking risks and getting caught trying, we are not going to have the opportunity to learn. I won't say that I like the fall. I hate it every time. Just this summer, as I was preparing a trip for summer research students in STEM who would be the first in their families to graduate from college, I did this thing that reflected my own worldview as a white, middle-class, middle-aged woman, and as a non-Oregonian. I said, y'all, we're gonna go out and do a community building event this summer. I want us to bond together. If any of you have ever done it, it's called voluntold or mandatory staff bonding, right? And I said, we're gonna do something that I think is just the coolest thing in Oregon, which is that you can go pick berries for free, just off the side of the road. Like, I didn't know that you could, where I come from, you could not just go get fruit on trees. So I said, we're gonna go on a berry picking for community building. And one of my students who pulled me aside after said, you know, Professor Drew, my family and I grew up picking onions in the field. I am in college so I can get out of the fields and get out of the picking. And then it's like my stomach just dropped. Like, man, I did it again, right? So that to have those moments where I'm gonna get caught trying, and I'm gonna mess up, and I'm gonna learn to apologize quickly. And I'm not going to over-apologize. That's another, tends to be a white woman pattern of, I'm gonna apologize now and again, I'm gonna text you, now I'm gonna email you, and then next time I see you, I'm gonna bring it up again about how much I learned from this last mistake I made. I've had to unlearn that conditioning, right? So the fifth gift, I would say, is an awareness of our investments in the work. I think sometimes if people say, what is your self-interest? There is a tendency to say, oh, well, that's very selfish. You shouldn't be involved in social justice work for your own interests. I actually disagree with that. I think that to have an investment and a self-interest is to have a stake. It's to have skin in the game. It is to have a way in which Leela Watson, who's an Aboriginal activist, anti-apartheid activist, she says, if you've come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. She was answering this question of white Christian missionaries who kept saying, how can we help? What can we do to help you? And she said, you can start figuring out how this system of colonization ensnares you and has you trapped and imprisoned. And then when you come to the table then, you won't leave. You know that expression when the going gets tough, right? When the proverbial crap hits the fan, people leave. It will always hit the fan. We have to be ready for that. If I am now here in this work because my liberation is linked up in it, I'm much more likely to stay for the long haul. If I'm here to fix you, to save you, to love you, and now you call me on my crap, I'm out. If I'm here because I need to be here for my own liberation, for our liberation, then I'm gonna be more likely to stay in the work. I think the other thing I notice on this piece, I frequently get asked as a white person in racial justice work about, well, who wants to give up privilege? I think our framing of the question is already problematic. I've learned to rethink it as, what do I stand to gain by an end to racism? Right? When the women's movement of the 1970s was working for women's lib, turns out men actually got freer in the process. So that I think for me as a white person in this work, I have to get clear on what are the 20 things I stand to gain by an end to racism. And sometimes it's simple stuff, like I won't have to feel guilty so much. Sometimes it's deep things, like maybe I can now have authentic relationships with women and people of color, right? So that the gains are unending, but I think we get in this zero-sum calculus around what will I lose. The last thing I'd say there about this gift is that our self-interest should be always being assessed and always evolving. What gets us to the table may not be what keeps us at the table for the long haul. And so that having those discussions with each other about what does make me invested in this work can help us get there. Lastly, the last gift that was poured into me is this gift of accountability. And it may not sound like a gift right up front. I think in part because accountability has been weaponized as only being about blame. Let's point the fingers, let's blame and shame. I think part of that comes from, it was sort of corporately taken over, such that bosses will talk to their employees about, I'm gonna hold you accountable for your work. It was never two directional, right? That rarely can we say to our supervisors and bosses, well, what about you? Do I get to evaluate you? so that ultimately accountability out in the popular thinking is not necessarily about movement building, right? So I think here, as Michael Scott talks about, I actually thrive under a lack of accountability, right? I believe that he does, and the people he's caricaturing do. But that in movements, accountability is something we often get foggy on. And what I would posit is that we actually know a lot more about accountability than we think we know. For example, if we have to submit receipts from this conference, we know what form we have to fill out. We know who has to get signatures on it, how it has to be copied. If any of you in here have ever done taxes, you know about accountability. You know what has to be done, what has to be put together, and by when. And yet, for some reason, it gets kind of cloudy when it's about social justice. So I would posit that accountability then is a value, a worldview, it is a practice. And that there's no such thing as accountability to oneself. So if I was to say to you, after this conference, what will you do to stay accountable to what you learned? Most people will answer, well, I will make sure that I do such and such. Accountability, by definition, is collective. It requires us to have other people holding us to our commitments, to our promises, to our worldview. It also involves us coming to understand feedback as a gift. Right? I don't know if any of you all have those people in your life. I get a call from one of my colleagues and friends named Roy, and he says, Drew, can I come by? I have some feedback to give you. Oh, my stomach drops, right? And I start steeling myself, bracing myself for whatever I'm about to hear. But that in ultimately, I know he's holding me accountable to what he knows my values to be. And so that we have to look for those communities that will hold us accountable. Lastly, one of my mentors, when put on the spot, she's like, everyone wants a definition of accountability in movement work. And she says, here's what I've come to understand, that I am answerable to and responsible for others in this social justice community. So therefore, rather than letting anyone else fall on their face, or rather than going and trying to be okayed by saying, oh, get a load of so-and-so, they're the real problem, I need to actually be answerable for and responsible for everyone else in this community. So I think that moving forward, if we can take about, do we have 5 minutes still? Or are we at the mark? Till 1. Okay, let's take 5 minutes. When have you practiced any of the 6 gifts, right? The praxis, the both and, the belt of many tools, falling and making mistakes, accountability, and my 5th one was knowing our self-interest. When have you practiced these and how? 5-minute check-in. If I could invite us to wrap up whatever we're in the middle of. Do you have announcements to make? Do you have announcements to make?
Oh yeah,
I'm just going to thank her. So thank you for this time. I hope that you all go on to continue to infuse this work, not just into your campus and community, but into your future life when you leave, those of you who are students, when you leave here. So thank you for this time. We did have a couple of announcements to dig into.
All right, so thank you, Emily Drew. Let's have this big round of applause. All right. Oh, I'll stand over here. Hello. Okay. So we will now start session 2 of the conference. So I hope you all have selected a workshop to attend. Just a reminder that workshops are on the east side of the building.